All right, Ian, we got a Patreon poll, don't we?
Patreon.com/CU podcast.
And what do you get there, Ian?
Stuff. You get...
Oh, okay.
My mom used to make a dinner called stuff when I was younger. It was kielbasa sausage, stir-fried with peppers, onions, over rice.
Okay.
Anyways, you get stuff there. You get a big hot bowl of stuff. You get...
A weekly writing?
Yeah, weekly writing. I did that. I tweeted it out.
You get the full video podcast?
You get a full video podcast. You get a hangout, which when was my last one? When's my next one?
You had it a week ago.
Oh, that's right. I did it.
You're falling apart, Ian. All right, and you get a poll topic.
I'm here.
In second place, will computer games ever be collectible as console games? 24%. And in first place, on the tail of our bad Super Nintendo 30th topic that you put a wet blanket on. Dual Super Nintendo Genesis releases. Which version was the superior option and why?
I did not try to put a wet blanket on it. How many times can I talk about the Super Nintendo?
As much as the 30 the zeros and fives required, Ian.
Okay, all right, fine. I do have to adhere to the laws of the zeros and the fives. So it's fun to think about the different versions of games that were on the Super Nintendo and Genesis. Sometimes they were the same game with, one being higher quality than the other. Sometimes they are different games with the same title, and, there'll be one that's a clear standout in terms of, which one's better. A couple examples that really jump to my mind. NHL hockey is one of the series that always strikes me as being a Genesis series. And I think it's because it played a little snappier, a little faster on the Genesis. It felt smoother. As you were talking to me earlier, you said that was due to an increased frame rate. I never really knew that.
I think the frame rate was better in the Genesis game. It was a little bit smoother.
Yeah, when they did like when they started doing the plug and plays, when those got real popular, and they did like the NHL one, they were the Genesis versions that they put on there. They are generally the ones that are considered the best. When you look at sports games that people actively search for, 94 on the Genesis is the specific one that I probably get asked for the most. Outside of like NBA Jam and things like that, I'm talking about like the yearly releases. 94 on the Genesis is the one.
Not 95, not 93, it's 94.
That people want. Another one that sticks out to me, because I actually had the Genesis version as a kid, is the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters game. Is very different between the two systems. The Genesis version is a totally different game than the Super Nintendo version, with different characters, different controls, a different fighting system. It's just, they're night and day differences. I really like the Genesis version because it has like a much darker color palette. It looks like they pulled kind of from the Mirage comics a little bit more.
Okay.
Right down to like a Triceraton being one of the characters in the game. The Super Nintendo version is more cartoony, and by all accounts, a far better playing fighting game.
Sure.
So that's one that always sticks out to me.
See, with fighting games, Power Rangers was a pure fighting game on Genesis, but it was a beat 'em up on Super Nintendo.
Yes. Correct. And there was a fighting game on the Super Nintendo that was Power Rangers, but it was not the same as the Power Rangers fighting game on the Genesis.
Yeah, so you saw this weird time in space where like the same game titles were being done by different devs. It's just weird how that worked out. Maybe because one didn't have time to do both versions, or I don't know. It's obviously there's a lot of games that were close.
Yeah, and then some of them, same licenses but different games, and they had different titles. Like the Tiny Toons game for the Genesis plays more like a Sonic the Hedgehog game, whereas the Tiny Toons on the Super Nintendo is more of a. There's still speed involved, but it's a slower paced platformer. I would actually say probably something more akin to a Mario game as opposed to a Sonic game. A big one that comes up all the time, and this is another example of two vastly different games, is the Aladdin Genesis versus the Super Nintendo.
That's one that's cited a lot about
Aladdin,
about being like it's different.
The Aladdin on the Genesis was done by Virgin Interactive, I believe.
Look it up.
And it's a platformer. Can't say. It's just entirely different. Do you have a sword for attacking? The levels are different, whereas the Super Nintendo game, you do not have a sword. The levels are different. It was made by Capcom,
Yes.
and there is a far greater focus on, I almost want to say like a simple bit of like acrobatic platforming. Like it's definitely more
Sort of
focused
about
on
hopping and then you throw the apples, whatever it is.
Yes.
And that's interesting that it'd be Capcom doing that. Like that's one of the bigger Super Nintendo publishers.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one to me because Capcom did have a long and storied run with the Disney properties, going all the way back to the NES, and that's probably like right around the time they made that cut. I don't actually know how the licensing worked, but that would have been, my guess, the last Capcom Disney game for quite some time.
But they also lean towards more third-party Super versus Genesis, I believe, for Capcom.
Oh, sure.
Just by pure number. They were like a preferred third party.
There was more, yes, there was more Capcom games on the Super Nintendo than there were on the Genesis.
So that,
that
probably might have been part of it. So they were like, well, we don't want to work on the Genesis one. Maybe it's a weird thing with Nintendo. So maybe then Disney had to then hire out, you know what I mean, or license it to them. Something like that might have happened. Maybe someone historically knows that, but that's an interesting point about that. I always forget, like, when you think about it, it's like, especially early on, there's not really Capcom, not a lot of Capcom games going on. You had the Strider arcade one. Early on.
You're talking about the Genesis?
Yeah, Genesis.
Yeah, you had Strider. You had Street Fighter later.
Like later on, but there's not like, you're not talking like a big amount.
That's weird. There was no Mega Mans.
At least not here.
Yes.
But anyway, that's an aside.
Anyway, yeah.
But just something I thought about, like how many they actually do. Oh, there's a list you can look up.
Ghouls and Ghosts, that would have been the
early
one that I was thinking of.
It's not a huge amount. I'm looking at it right now.
No, it's really not. Then you immediately jump into stuff like
Forgotten Worlds, that's early.
Mickey Mania Mercs would have been early.
The Punisher arcade port.
Saturday Night Slam Masters.
They only did about, 12 games? They did 12 games only on the Genesis?
Yeah, really not a huge
Holy
amount
shit.
of support.
I know I wasn't pulling out of my butt. They didn't do anything on the Genesis. And the Genesis was out for 9-10 years, that console.
What are some examples that you've got?
Let's go into, you want to talk about Mortal Kombat? That's another huge one.
Oh, yeah, that was a massive one. And that
was a huge one to top.
That sold Genesis.
That helped Genesis.
Yes, that helped Sega. Having blood in the game clearly...
Via blood code.
ABAC, ABACAB, ABAC, ABB. That moved systems. The characters were smaller. The graphics not nearly as clear.
Sound was terrible.
Sound was bad, but it had the blood.
Yes.
And
gameplay was actually, from what I heard, I hadn't played a lot. Gameplay was a little superior to the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo one is a little bit clunky on the controls. When I went back and reviewed it, I did not remember the controls being that clunky.
Yeah, no, it feels like shit.
So, from that perspective, just for the gameplay elements and the fact that you got blood and fatalities, that killed it right there for them.
Yep. So, yeah, that's a big one.
My cousin wrote a letter to Nintendo complaining about the Super Nintendo version.
You can say
it sounds like a lot of people did, because then they went back on that no blood stuff like pretty damn quickly. They saw them probably getting killed on there.
Oh, yeah. Street Fighter was obviously different between the two systems. Genesis basically got 2 Dash, which is like a
they got
turbo.
Champion.
Yeah, Turbo Champion.
And so from what I don't remember playing it. They obviously only had the 3-button controller. So that was bad.
Well, the 6 came out with that.
Sure.
Yes.
On the side. It wasn't packed in, but
no.
So you couldn't play. It was unplayable. I remember my one friend did have it. It was unplayable. It's unplayable with 3 buttons. You can play Mortal Kombat with 3 and not 4 buttons, only having 1 punch button. You can still do it. It's playable.
I'm just going to make the argument that you can't play any fucking game without the right number of buttons.
Sure. Using start for the block was rough, but it wasn't. It
was bad.
But see, you need 6 buttons. You need 6 buttons for fighting games.
Yes.
So, but from what I remember, obviously graphically, the Super Nintendo Street Fighter 2 blows away the Genesis ones. Some people prefer the Genesis sound for that, for the synthesis versus the MIDI sounds. I think for Street Fighter 2...
wavetable versus FM synthesis. I think that really just comes down to preference.
But it's funny that when you look at the 3 versions...
You can make an argument that the Genesis was closer to the arcade, but I think really if you want to talk sound, it comes down to the PC Engine version having the closest sound.
Yes. And the PC Engine version actually looks better than the Genesis one. It actually looks
got a little less
going.
I have it, and it's one of my favorite things to talk. It's one of my favorite games. Street Fighter I like, but I just love it because it was an example, kind of like Doom on the Switch, like the modern Doom on the Switch. It's just an example of people making a game work on a system where it shouldn't, and not only doing it but making it work fantastically. Like it's a gorgeous.
It's actually a closer port in terms of
lots of people will tell you that it's a closer. It's closer to the arcade game
because
than either Genesis or Super.
It includes all the bonus rounds. The Super Nintendo
Yes.
only includes the car. It doesn't include the barrels, and it also has like the short elbow that Ryu does, like the little in between. Super Nintendo doesn't have those. They took those out for some reason. For whatever weird reason, Super Nintendo took out those like in between moves.
So that's a great game, but again, much like the Genesis version, the stock controllers are you can't. If you think you can't play it with a 3-button controller, you can't play it with a fucking 2-button controller.
So Mortal Kombat, you want to go Genesis, even though it looks and sounds like trash, it plays better. But for Street Fighter 2, you want to go Super Nintendo. And then I put down NBA Jam because you said you had some thoughts on that. I don't remember playing the NBA Jam on Genesis too much.
So this is one where I can't actually verify it, but I've always heard that this was one of those instances like the NHL where
they got a little bit better.
Where it was a little bit better. I also think there was something that's in the Genesis version that's not in the Super Nintendo version, but I honestly can't remember. It's not one that I can talk about knowledgeably. I will say
different devs. They're different ports, I believe.
I think so.
Genesis.
Arena, I think Arena did Genesis, which was an acclaimed dev of all
I do
things.
not like, I'm an arcade sub, I do not like the Super Nintendo NBA Jam.
I play the Genesis one fairly frequently.
So there would be something to be said for the differences in gameplay. They look similar.
Sure.
But, and probably sound somewhat similar. Who did the actual release? Now I'm curious before we move on here.
Like I said, I think it was Arena for Genesis. I don't know who would have done Super.
It says Iguana.
Oh, Iguana.
So Iguana.
Okay.
So Iguana did both of them. Okay.
All right.
They don't play.
That could just be a holdover from me being a kid and being like, well, I've got the Genesis, so the Genesis version's better.
And you played that fine with only the 3-button layout? What did you use for turbo? You hold it on A and hitting B? How did that work?
No, that's it. It's shoot, jump, shoot, pass.
Turbo in the middle?
Turbo in the middle, yeah.
That makes sense.